Oblivion holds a special place in my heart. And it's not because of the standard bumf people go on about, something like this. Oblivion has long been praised by fans and critics alike for its engaging gameplay, compelling storyline and detailed character development. Its vast open world and intricate quest lines set a new standard for open world RPGs, cementing its place as one of the defining games of its era. Which is all true, of course. I love all those things about Oblivion as much as the next fan, but what gives Oblivion its special place in my heart is its cookie charm, utter jankiness, and ability to play host to some absolutely madcap emergent gameplay. And there's a core component to that I'd like to discuss in this video. Its chaotic, oftentimes wonderfully unpredictable radiant artificial intelligence system. So we're going to take a look at it, the history behind it, how it was originally meant to be something far more complicated than what we got in the end, and how the original builds caused complete mayhem when playtested, and how what remains is still so completely, utterly charming beyond belief. And I'll probably throw in some fantastic insights from the developers way back when they were trying to implement the system. If, like me, you've spent an ungodly amount of time in Cyrodiil, you'll have seen the final form of Oblivion's radiant AI in action many times. You might have been amused by a guard killing an NPC only for them to walk away and return to the body, shouting that there's been a murder. Or maybe you've come across another town guard brutally executing a seemingly desperate citizen over something as trivial as stealing food. Or you yourself have accidentally picked up an object in a tavern only for all the NPCs in there to rush you, zombie horde style, wanting nothing more than your immediate demise. The game's AI has led to absolutely countless bizarre and often hilarious moments. To be honest, this is, in my opinion, a massive part of what's secured Oblivion's beloved place in gaming history. Radiant AI is just so memeable. And the thing is, it truly is AI. Sure, it isn't to the level of the chatbots we have nowadays or potential future AI advancements, but it really was something incredibly advanced, especially for the time. I had to dig, even so far as using the Wayback Machine for this quote from Bethesda programmer Steve Meister, which I think was given in the early 2000s, though I can't confirm exactly when. Read a book on AI and you'll find things very similar to what we're doing. The reason it's AI and not scripting is because it uses goals and rules to determine how something is going to be accomplished. The designer establishes the goals, sets parameters such as responsibility, aggression, confidence on the actors, and leaves it up to the rules that have been established in the code to determine how the behaviour plays out. It is most definitely artificial intelligence in the academic sense of the word. It's not a neural net. NPCs don't learn. But that's not the all-encompassing definition of the field of artificial intelligence anyway. So, given what Steve has said, and that it shows such amazing ambition, what were the goals here? Why were they wanting to implement such a system? And why is it called Radiant? It's important for us to understand that before we dig into the pitfalls of its creation and what the final form of Radiant AI looked like. According to the developers, their goal was to create a world where NPCs weren't static background characters standing around waiting for the player to engage with them. Instead, they wanted to build a dynamic, living world where every NPC had their own personality, objectives, and daily routine. Whether they were merchants, guards, citizens, or even bandits, each NPC would have a role to fulfill, complete with a schedule and the ability to interact with others around them. According to an interview Todd Howard gave way back sometime around 2004 or 2005, using the Radiant AI system, we have the ability to do things on a larger scale. Where other games' NPCs require individual scripting, we can simply provide our NPCs with goals, and our system allows them to think on their own and complete the task. It allows us to have the same advanced behaviour but on a massive scale. And beyond that, it was about how the system would make the player feel. Radiant AI was supposed to make NPCs behave in a way that felt organic, allowing them to live their lives independently of the player's actions. Todd continues again from the same interview. The other thing it does is give the game a more organic feel than scripting could. NPCs won't always be standing there doing the exact same thing at the same time. The fact that your experience and what's going on in the world around you in your game is a bit different than other people is pretty cool. The conversations you'll overhear and subsequent quests you'll be able to get as a result will vary. It makes the world feel much more realistic and alive. A key part of Radiant AI is responsibility. That sounds incredibly vague, but in essence, each NPC in Oblivion has an internal attribute known as responsibility, which dictates their moral compass, or lack thereof. Characters with low responsibility, such as bandits and thieves, have little regard for laws and will steal from or attack others without hesitation. But this behaviour isn't limited to criminals. If a hungry NPC needs food and they're desperate enough, and their responsibility score allows it, they might decide to go hunting. In theory, this is completely logical. In execution, it means wandering into the wilderness and attempting to fight a wolf, a bear, or even a mountain lion. Inevitably, you'll stumble across a bandit's corpse, the unfortunate result of a poor life choice dictated by AI logic. This is a definite example of emergent gameplay going on without the player needing to be part of it at all, and is still something that can be seen in the final release version of the game. On the opposite end of the spectrum, high responsibility NPCs, such as town guards, have an unwavering sense of duty and an almost comical dedication to upholding the law. Theft, no matter how minor, is not tolerated one bit. The punishment for picking up an unattended apple? Death. NPCs caught committing a crime won't be given a chance to explain themselves, nor will they have the option to pay a fine. Since Bethesda never implemented a system where NPCs could settle their bounties, the only resolution is for the guards to kill them on sight. Again, this amusing situation is one that can still be witnessed to this day in the game, and to be honest, it adds to the charm. During development, however, the system had a tendency to spiral into complete anarchy. This was because the NPCs were given a lot more freedom than they ended up with in the release version of the game. While NPCs did sleep, eat, and perform their assigned duties at specific times like in the final game, this earlier version of Radiant AI gave them the ability to make their own decisions to a whole new degree. This meant they could act on impulse, choosing how to achieve their goals based on the world around them with very little in the way of restrictions. And when you give a non-playable character absolute free will, the results are rarely predictable. NPCs were capable of taking actions that Bethesda developers may not have entirely accounted for, and more often than not, these actions led to absolute chaos. Before Oblivion was released, Bethesda realised that they had to contend with just how unpredictable Radiant AI could be. At its most extreme, the system was so out of control that it threatened to derail the entire game. Bethesda quickly realised that, without some restrictions, the AI could cause absolute mayhem. Left unchecked, it went far, far beyond NPCs adding a bit of flavour and immersion to the world. It was a case of them completely breaking it. Like many games of its time, and even today to be honest, Oblivion promised somewhat more than it ultimately delivered. Before its release, as we've seen from the Todd Howard interview, Bethesda spoke at length about its revolutionary Radiant AI system, an ambitious attempt to create NPCs that could think for themselves, adapt to situations, and interact with the world in ways that felt real. The goal clearly went far beyond simply adding personality to NPCs. It was about giving them autonomy. They wouldn't simply wait around for the player to engage with them. They would have desires, needs, and the ability to make their own decisions to satisfy those needs. The problem? It worked too well. As we've touched upon, Bethesda developers quickly realised that Radiant AI was so advanced that NPCs were taking their autonomy to game-breaking extremes. I managed to find another page on the Wayback Machine where an unnamed developer shared some stories. In early builds of the game, guards weren't simply stationed around towns, they worked as a unit. If one got hungry and decided to wander off in search of food, the rest of the guards followed, leaving entire settlements completely unprotected. Seeing that there were no guards, NPCs with low responsibility scores, thieves, bandits, and other opportunistic criminals took full advantage of the situation, looting shops and homes freely. If caught, they would be attacked, which often led to a chain reaction of escalating violence. What started as a minor theft could end in a bloodbath, leaving the player to stumble upon a town filled with corpses, all because one guard decided he wanted a sandwich. It wasn't just about crimes that got out of control either. Some NPCs were given goals that they had to complete no matter the cost. An NPC assigned to rake leaves and another assigned to sweep paths worked fine until they swapped tools. The raker, now with a broom, and the sweeper, now with a rake, could not complete their tasks correctly. One eventually killed the other to obtain the correct tool. Other situations included one where a minotaur was assigned to guard a unicorn. However, because it was an aggressive creature, it repeatedly tried to kill the unicorn instead of protecting it. And in another, a tester dropped the Skull of Corruption, a magical item that creates evil copies of NPCs on the ground. An NPC picked it up and used it on the player character and created a duplicate of said player character. This duplicate then went on a killing spree, attacking every NPC in sight. Another example of Radiant AI's pre-release insanity that still seems to be talked about more memorably today comes from Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood questline. In a story shared by Emil Pagliarulo about one particular mission, the player was meant to meet a shady merchant who sold skooma, but during playtesting, developers kept running into the same problem. The merchant was already dead before the player could reach him, because the game's skooma addicts, programmed to need their fix, had gotten to him first. If he had skooma, they would buy it. If he ran out, they would kill him. As a result, the entire quest was impossible to complete because the dealer never lived long enough to sell anything. Emil spoke further about this issue on a broader scale, describing the AI as so advanced that it actively broke the game. In some cases, we the developers have had to consciously tone down the types of behaviour they carry out. Again, why? Because sometimes the AI is so damned smart and determined it screws up our quests. Seriously, sometimes it's gotten so weird it's like dealing with a holodeck that's gone sentient. Imagine playing The Sims and your Sims have a penchant for murder and theft. So a lot of the time this stuff is funny and amazing and emergent and it's awesome when it happens. Other times it's so unexpected it breaks stuff. Designers need a certain amount of control over the scenarios they create, and things can go haywire when NPCs have a mind of their own. Bethesda clearly had no choice but to tone things down. Left as it was, Oblivion's world would have been an unpredictable mess of self-inflicted disasters, and even if it was absolutely hilarious, it probably would have been completely unplayable. And yet, there's something amazingly compelling about what might have been. Take a moment to imagine a version of Oblivion where NPCs weren't restricted at all, where cities would collapse into anarchy and chaos because one skooma addict started a riot, where quest givers had to be tracked down because they were too busy stealing junk from someone's house, where nobles and bodyguards could end up killing each other over something as minuscule as a stolen loaf of bread. Over the years, there's been chat on forums about the possibility of restoring Radiant AI to its original form, but I myself haven't been able to find anything that truly does it. I'm going to ask here at this junction, if anyone knows of a really good mod that does it, let me know. I'd be interested to try it out. With that being said, it's tantalising to think that a version of Oblivion with fully unleashed Radiant AI exists somewhere in Bethesda's archives. And if there's truly any justice in this crazy universe we all inhabit, one day they'll let us see it, or maybe it'll appear sort of like that PSP build. However it appears, if it ever does, whether through archived release or an as good as the real thing mod, I'd be itching to see what the chaotic world of proto-Radiant AI looked like. In any case, as we've discussed, Bethesda had to rein it in, a bit like trying to recapture Frankenstein's monster after he's been let loose. Bethesda had to make a choice between maintaining that structure or embracing the chaos. They chose structure. Even then, the final version of Oblivion's Radiant AI that we ended up with has a charm. It still allows us as a player to track NPC movements with some very long routines, see them interact with their environment, and witness the consequences of their actions to a certain degree. It makes the world feel interconnected, and it still allows, on occasion, some of the AI's quirks to pop up. And that quirkiness, reined in as it is a huge part of what makes Oblivion special for me. Sure, the version of Radiant AI that did make it into the final release of Oblivion wasn't quite the wild, unsupervised experiment Bethesda originally envisioned. The system was stripped back and reined in, leaving behind a structured yet somewhat unpredictable AI system that dictated how NPCs behaved. Instead of the dreamed of fully dynamic world where characters would act freely, NPCs were given schedules rather than absolute autonomy. While the NPCs thankfully didn't just exist in some static, boring form simply to serve the player, their actions were now carefully constrained within a set of rules designed to stop them from burning Cyrodiil to the ground. But as mentioned earlier, it still allows for some quirkiness. Here's an example. NPCs have goals, such as eating at a certain time each day, sleeping at night, or going to work. How they achieve those goals depends on their responsibility score, something we looked at earlier, a hidden value between 0 and 100 that determines how law-abiding they are. NPCs with the low score, 30 or below, would steal if they needed something and had no other way to obtain it, and if they got caught, in the final build there's still no negotiation, no second chances. The guards will still kill them on the spot, just as we saw in earlier builds. And even with the reined-in Radiant AI, a big part of what makes Oblivion so fascinating is that it invites you to watch the NPCs. In video games, where the player is usually meant to be the main force driving the world forward, Oblivion instead encourages a bit of passive observation. In fact, it even builds a quest around the concept, a very famous quest which you'll all know about, but I'll tell you about it anyway. A paranoid elf named Glarthir enlists the player to stalk his supposed enemies and report back. Now, while this quest is framed as the ravings of a madman, it serves another between-the-lines purpose. Similarly to some of the quests in Goodsprings and Fallout New Vegas, it teaches the player how the mechanics work and how Radiant AI works. It shows that NPCs do have routines, habits, and patterns of behaviour that exist outside the player's direct influence. And once you've learned about those mechanics and you start to watch other NPCs in the game, you begin to soak up the total quirkiness that still remains in Oblivion, and I absolutely love it. For example, NPCs, yeah, they eat, but they don't really eat. They can lift the same apple to their mouth for an hour while sitting in a tavern before suddenly standing up and walking home. Yeah, they talk to each other, but the conversations are robotic, endlessly looping through the same scripted dialogue with no real sense of communication happening between them, and it can be quite funny. Bethesda's grand vision for the living world was ultimately too ambitious for the game's technology, and so what's left is kind of an uncanny imitation of life, especially given that their Total Freedom build of Radiant AI nearly caused a purge-like reality to overwhelm Cyrodiil. What remains in the game is like a simulation built by something that doesn't really understand how humans work. Look at it this way. If you described human behaviour to an alien and asked it to create a game world based on those descriptions, the result probably would look something like Oblivion. And it's beautiful. And why is it so beautiful? Well, we'd need to look at some of the other hidden NPC behaviours that still remain in the final game. Things the game never tells you about, things that most players will never notice. All over Cyrodiil there are characters who are secretly having affairs. For example, if you follow them, you'll find them sneaking into other people's houses, sleeping in beds they shouldn't be in. There are skooma addicts who make the monthly pilgrimages from their home cities to Bravil, where they meet in the hidden den to take skooma with the other addicts before returning home 2 days later. These actions aren't quest-related, strictly speaking. They serve no greater purpose in the game's story. There's no reason for them to do this, and yet they do. If this is happening in the game world, if these events are taking place without the player's knowledge, then it begs the player to question, what else is happening? What other potential unseen stories are unfolding beyond our reach? This is the kind of possibility and immersion that I'm always searching for in RPGs. I'm sad to say that I'm not sure I'll ever find something quite as quirky as Oblivion ever again. And while that saddens me, I feel a strange sense of comfort that Oblivion even exists at all. The idea that a game world exists beyond what we can see, that it continues functioning whether we're watching or not, is intoxicating. It's the same concept that has driven the recent developments in AI in the last few years, the desire to create artificial life, to bring something into existence that can function independently. And sure, we could go around the houses arguing as to whether AI is any good or whether it's actually going to cause massive problems and the moral implications and so on and so forth, but when it comes to this game and this implementation, as stunted as it was compared to the pre-release builds, Oblivion's Radiant AI still manages to suggest something really special for the player, a world that exists with or without you. So maybe I was a bit wrong when I was saying earlier that Bethesda overpromised and underdelivered with Oblivion's Radiant AI. I mean, it wasn't what they wanted to begin with, but it still managed to create a really special form of immersion. Let's have another look at what Todd Howard said about Radiant AI way back before Oblivion came out. Where other games' NPCs require individual scripting, we can simply provide our NPCs with goals, and our system allows them to think on their own and complete the task. It allows us to have that same advanced behaviour, but on a massive scale. The other thing it does is give the game a more organic feel than scripting could. NPCs won't always be standing there doing the exact same thing at the same time. The fact that your experience and what's going on in the world around you in your game is a bit different than other people is pretty cool. And rereading that and looking at what Oblivion is like in its final form, it sounds pretty much like what he said. Those general goals were met, I think, and while Oblivion's AI isn't perfect, it does create a world that feels strangely alive. Sure, the guards talk about mudcrabs a bit too often, and sure, it takes an NPC 3 hours to eat a single apple, but at the same time, they seem to live. They seem to feel alive. And few other RPGs manage to pull this off, if any, truly, in the way that Oblivion did. Oblivion's world is a mess of strange behaviours. NPCs that don't quite act sentient, but at other times, you'd swear they are. And for me, that makes Oblivion incredibly compelling. As ever, there's always tons of player discussion around these games. Radiant AI is no exception. It's developed an almost mythological status, not just for what it accomplished, but for what it could have been. And players are more than happy to share stories about the everyday madcap occurrences they've come across. One player described an event in which an NPC stole food from another character's inventory, setting off an immediate fight. Typically, this minor infraction was the catalyst for complete chaos. The victim called for help, the guards got involved, and before the player even realised what was happening, a seemingly peaceful town square had erupted into a full-scale battle, all because someone had decided they were a little too hungry to follow the law. Other players have observed similarly bizarre AI interactions. In the Dark Brotherhood Sanctuary, one of the Argonian assassins was once seen getting into a fight with their own sibling, potentially over stolen food. And the situation escalated to the point where one of them was killed. Brotherly love, eh? Another player exploring the forests near Bruma stumbled across 2 Imperial Rangers engaged in a full-on duel, repeatedly firing arrows at each other until one of them finally collapsed. Most likely one had accidentally hit the other while fighting a wild animal, and Oblivion's AI, determined to treat every action as intentional, refused to let the slight go unpunished. Now, this is of course your opportunity to share Radiant AI stories in the comments below. Pop down your memories, your funniest and craziest stories while you watch the rest of the video. So for me, I've made it clear that what makes Radiant AI so memorable is that even in the stripped back form, it creates the illusion of a world that's constantly moving, shifting and reacting. And yeah, while Bethesda marketed it as revolutionary and we've accepted that the final form did somewhat meet their promises, the truth is it wasn't entirely new. It could be argued that earlier games, particularly Ultima 7, out in 1992, Gothic, which came out in 2001, and Arcanum, also in 2001, had already attempted similarly AI-driven worlds, arguably with even more success in some areas. Though I will defer to experts in this area, this is what I've come across in my research on Radiant AI implementations, or AI implementations that would have met Todd Howard's promises. Ultima 7, for example, according to my research, featured NPCs with their own schedules, needs and routines. They worked jobs, went home, and even reacted dynamically to the player's actions. In some cases, it seemed that their behaviour was maybe even more advanced than Oblivion's. If players killed too many sheep in a given area, it could disrupt the local economy, leading to food shortages. This system extended beyond basic scripting, allowing for genuine cause and effect changes in the world. In a similar vein, Gothic introduced a world where NPCs had unique personalities and tasks. They went to work, ate meals, and reacted to the player in ways that felt more organic than most RPGs of the time. If the player drew their weapon in a town, NPCs would warn them. If the player didn't comply, they'd escalate the situation, potentially leading to a fight. It wasn't a scripted response, but rather an actual AI-driven system that seemed to determine how characters responded to threats. In this context, Oblivion's AI, while impressive, was maybe not as groundbreaking as Todd Howard claimed, given that games like Ultima 7 and Gothic had seemingly already done similar things. That being said, those systems could have been seen as an inspiration, of course. It could be said though that while those other games existed, they were more niche titles. Oblivion was the game that potentially brought these ideas into the mainstream. The average player in 2006 had never seen an RPG where NPCs lived their own lives, where they had jobs and homes and schedules that weren't just tied to the player's progress. Another interesting comparison could be made with Ultima Online, an MMO game that featured an ecosystem where player actions could have unintended consequences. If too many wolves were killed in an area, for instance, the rabbit population would explode. If too many rabbits existed, crops would be destroyed, leading to economic collapse. Oblivion, in its earliest builds, had similar mechanics planned, but they were ultimately removed to keep the world from descending into chaos. Now, whether or not Oblivion's Radiant AI was truly revolutionary, one thing is certain. It left a lasting impression on me, and it would seem a great many others. Even today, nearly 2 decades later, players still share stories of the game's bizarre and unpredictable NPC interactions on forums. Videos of Radiant AI going haywire can be found all over YouTube, and I have no doubt that there will be a ton of comments with amusing stories below this very video. For some people, Oblivion's Radiant AI represents an ambitious experiment that was never fully realised. For others, it's a really core part of why Oblivion remains so beloved. Not despite its quirkiness, but because of it. For all its flaws, I feel that Oblivion's version of Radiant AI, reined in or not, gave the game a sense of life. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it amped up the immersion in a way that no scripted system could ever hope to replicate. Even when the AI was clearly struggling against the game's limitations, it still felt like it was trying. There's something charming about how Oblivion reaches beyond its capabilities, how it asks us as players to suspend disbelief just enough to buy into its version of a living world. The NPCs are weird and robotic, the dialogue is stilted, and the sudden zoom-ins during conversations make even the most normal of interactions feel quite funny. And yet, those awkward moments work. They elevate Oblivion from being just another game into something really special. A game that manages to be both incredibly immersive and deeply, unintentionally comedic. Look at it this way. If we take later Bethesda games as polished theatre productions with every line meticulously memorised, Oblivion is a bizarre experimental skill play. The teachers are in the wings prompting the performers who forget their lines, the acting is clumsy, the makeup and sets are terrible, but somehow that makes it all the more lovable. And so, in the end, while Oblivion's Radiant AI was never quite what Bethesda initially envisioned, it still achieved something remarkable. It gave Oblivion a unique charm, one that no other RPG has managed to replicate, for me anyway. The game's world feels alive, even if that life is often hilariously flawed. It's an uncanny simulation of reality, a world that at times seems to follow its own bizarre logic. And that's why it'll always stick in my mind, why I'll always go back to it. And Radiant AI is a defining part of the game's identity. It's the reason why, all this time later, I find the story around the creation of Radiant AI really fascinating, and still find the final version in the game manages to surprise me. And it's not just me. As we've said, lots of players are still sharing stories and videos, still laughing at the quirks, still exploring Cyrodiil and stumbling upon totally mad emergent gameplay. It's why, despite all the jank, all the weird animations, and all the mad Radiant dialogue conversations, Oblivion is so damned lovable. So, if you haven't shared a story yet, do so now. I'm really keen to read them. And with that, see you next time.